Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everybody. All 600 and some odd of you around the planet. What an honor and privilege it is to spend a half an hour talking with you. I'm truly excited about this because I get to spend it with Anand, who was a student of mine 10 years ago and has gone on to a wonderful career here in the last 10 years that you just heard about. Anand was a teaching assistant with me, helped work on a critical edition of the textbook when he was here, but since he's graduated has helped me teach a good bit over the years, not only here but in other places around the globe. So Anand, welcome. Good morning.
Good to be here.
We are going to try something insane. We're going to talk about our favorite topic, entrepreneurship, and it's in a technology context. And talk about what some of our favorite things are about that topic. That's why we call it the spirit of entrepreneurship, because we're going to talk about methods, but we're also going to talk about behaviors and attitudes having to do with what is obviously something that's fascinating to everybody around the world. I mean, business leaders of large companies, small companies, governments, education, they all are very passionate about the topic. So we want to talk about it, but also look a little deeper, because we come at it from as educators. We actually think you can teach entrepreneurship. We actually means, another way to put it, we actually think you can learn it. And that's what's made our friendship so tight over the last 10 years since you were a student. You have anything to say about that?
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so let's dive in. Here's a picture of let's go here. Let me just go to the next one. There we go. Start that. There we go. There's a picture of Silicon Valley. That's where we are talking to you from. It is the home of a lot of technology companies that have changed the world, but this has been going on for 80 years. So we look at Silicon Valley. I mean, certainly it's where Anand's employed and it's where Stanford University is located, but we look at it not as just a physical place, but we look at it as a laboratory. I mean, a gigantic laboratory of economics to be studied and observed regarding the way it operates. So that is where we're coming from, and we feel very, very lucky to be next door to it. But the things that we're going to be chatting about are applicable to any part of the world, any geography, and we have them. I'm sure we have them on this call. Any continent. I'm currently helping teach a course in the United Arab Emirates, for example, and we're using the techniques that you might think of as Silicon Valley techniques, but they're certainly applicable there. So let's do a little bit of I'm getting used to this. There we go. Let's do a little bit of diving into what we mean by entrepreneurship. We're going to concentrate on the two in the middle here. Here's four different variations of the word: entrepreneur, entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial ecosystem. At the first and the fourth ones are not the focus of today's webinar. They have to do with things. Well, movies are made about individuals who are entrepreneurs. The Steve Jobs' movies and things like that. Social Network for Zuckerberg. The last one is the domain of economists who like to study, how do these Silicon Valleys pop up in various regions of the world? And that's fascinating in and of itself, sure. But it's not our focus today. We're going to focus in on those two in the middle. And one of them is, think of it as entrepreneurship. And those are methods and frameworks. So we're going to discuss a few of those. But then in the spirit of our title, the spirit of entrepreneurship, we are going to talk about entrepreneurial matters like a mindset, attitudes, and skills and behaviors. So go ahead.
One of the reasons that you all are here and one of the core theses of this course in Stanford University is that this is a thing that can be taught. And I think to Tom's point, one of the things that the school has spent a lot of time putting together is materials on how to effectively teach you the processes, the tools, and the methodology. So one of the things that was my assumption when I got into this in the first place was you either have it or you don't. You were born with it. I think it's a very common misconception. So hopefully we'll be able to lay out today some frameworks for how to think about this problem, how to actually be self-directed in your own improvement at the skill.
Yeah, and we humbly consider ourselves entrepreneurs. but I don't think I was born with it, and I don't know how you feel. I don't think you're born. It was absolutely something.
It's very much not the original plan. It is a teachable skill.
Yeah. So this next slide is as wordy as it gets today, folks. It's an academic definition of entrepreneurship, and I put it up there, especially underlining that entrepreneurship is pursuing opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. That was developed by a wonderful Harvard professor named Howard Stevenson, and it has been decades ago, in the 80s, when entrepreneurship was only taught in the business schools. By the way, just to reaffirm, you are talking to the engineering school today. Do you have an MBA?
No.
Did you ever go to business school?
I have an undergrad and a master's degree, both in engineering.
Yeah, and I have an MBA, but I've really been studying big data all my life, so this is not about we're speaking to anybody on the call today, whether you go to business school or will ever go to business school. So this is something that can be learned by anybody. So the nice thing is though this pursuit of opportunity without resources currently controlled, that has allowed us to see this as a process, to see entrepreneurship as a process, and that therefore take an engineer's mindset toward understanding it. So that's what we're going to do to give you a taste for that today. So let's do this in a graphical way. So I'm still getting used to this. Yeah. This slide, and I hope it's coming across there. It looks like in the middle there it's bleeding out. But the top half there says product or service colliding with a market. And it says that whole phase, what's going on there, is opportunity recognition. Entrepreneurs start with opportunity recognition. They start from the top. They search for a good fit. And you sometimes hear this term, product market fit. That is the search that's going on to find a fit between a problem, in other words, a market, and a solution, in other words, a product or a service to solve that problem. So that's first. Then they think about how to gather resources. So this is a very simple model, but it was the backbone of how we organized the textbook and some of the courses that we've taught. Let me contrast that to going from the bottoms up. That down below in that box, it might be a little hard to read, it says pursuit of opportunity. Managers, and what I was taught, truth be told, when I was an MBA student many centuries ago, what we were taught as an MBA student was to manage things, manage property, manage people, manage money. And that's how your opportunity pursuit started after you determined how much budget you had or how many people you had to work with. I'm just being a little provocative there to say that's where the bureaucrats start. They see the world from that vantage point as from top down. All right, so let's illustrate some of this. My arrow keys don't work, so somebody take me back there. All right, thank you so much. Let me ask you, Anand, what does it mean to you?
Sure.
What is entrepreneurship? Because everybody on the call can then make a sort of decision. What does entrepreneurship mean to them? But what does it mean to you?
Yeah, for those of you thinking about this either as a career path or something you're interested in, one of the reasons that I got into it is, like you said, I perceived it to be the most interesting way to solve big problems. Because like you mentioned, it's a converse way of seeing the world. I approach the world with what problem can we solve, how big is it, and why is it important? And the opposite mode is, well, I only have two people, so I can't make a difference. Mm-hmm. And I think, to see some of the questions that people are asking, the thing that got me very excited about entrepreneurship in general is I perceive it to be a very impactful way to make a difference in the world. That's kind of the reason that I'm involved in it.
All right, so let's take a deeper look into, can you bring it next, my arrow key somewhere? Yeah, thanks, appreciate it. Let's go one more slide. Thanks. All right, here's the three questions we want to use to organize the rest of the talk. And again, we're looking at it in the context of Silicon Valley, but frankly the whole planet. How did the Apples, how did the Microsofts, how did the Googles, how did the Facebooks be so disruptive? And nowadays, of course, it's all about Uber. How did they become so disruptive? How did they go from being just an idea into something that is an industry standard? All right. First one, it has to do with telling a story. The question is, why is your venture a true opportunity? But we're going to go deeper into this popular notion of, well, make sure and have a good story to tell, which is a story is what's your purpose and what's your strategy. Second one we're going to do is, as a startup, what is the major risk to reduce as soon as possible? And that is more in the execution mode of, well, yeah, okay, I got a story, but how do I actually prove it or, take a stab at it? And the third one is about culture. That's also very, very popular. So the first one's about story. Second one's about testing, and better known as the lean startup methods. And then the third one is about culture of innovation. So let's pop through each one, and we'll use Anand's experiences to illustrate them. All right, first one's what is a true venture opportunity? In other words, we all have ideas, which is good. I mean, we've been having ideas ever since childhood, and that's terrific. But ideas are not enough. What what we work on in teaching is, okay, the next step is determine if it's a true opportunity. Describe it as a true opportunity. I like starting with purpose. We got two generations on the phone call here, and I didn't realize this until your generation came along, even that purpose matters. The why matters. It's not just about making money. It's about making meaning, as we say, or doing something meaningful. So the world right now has gigantic challenges. Here's some categories of them. Anything from sustainability to economic stability to the infrastructure issues to human health and education. Obviously, the one I care about and dedicated the last 20 some odd years of my life is education. You're involved in digital and physical infrastructure, but in past lives you were working in environment and clean tech startups. So there's some purpose to this. We observe that the best entrepreneurs and the ones that you work with in your companies or you invest in your investing activities, they have some reason to do this, and I guess you could say save the world. It's more pragmatic than that, but that's what drives them.
Yeah, a lot of the best people I work with tend to be, I'd say, more mission-driven than anything else, and there's a lot of comments in some of the questions. Some of the most talented entrepreneurs I've worked with are doing things now like starting companies for people with autism to teach them software programming. So I think that there's a really important component of it's worthwhile to solve big problems that matter for the world, and that is something that sometimes gets missed. So I'm excited to see that there's a lot of interest in it.
Well, that's a big point for us today, gang. Which one's for you? Entrepreneurship starts there, not entrepreneurship, starts there, not at, oh my goodness, this is my path to make a lot of money.
Yep.
All right, so let's keep building on that. The flip side of that coin is, well, if that's the pull, then when somebody is explaining a story of their venture and explain why it's a true opportunity, they are also talking about the push. There's been all these waves of innovation over the last few centuries. I mean, frankly, since the dawn of civilization, you can go back to fire. But this is from our textbook, and it lays out a few waves since the 1700s. Ironically, one of them is railroads. And we're at a university that exists because Leland Stanford was in the railroad business. But let's fast forward. There's software that I got to ride when I helped Symantec get underway many, many years ago. And there's the internet, which you've been riding for a while. These waves keep coming. Yep. So what's the point? What's the big point here? The point is you catch one of these, it's pretty lucky. Yep. I mean, in other words, luck favors the prepared mind, as they say. Yep. So in this case, riding one of these waves makes it an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And part of my background, I also worked in venture capital. One of the things that we thought a lot about was how you combine the push and the pull.
Yeah.
As an example, if you're really driven by, let's say, environment and sustainability, how can you use technology, which is arguably one of the current waves we're in, to have a big impact on that problem? So one of the skills that I think good entrepreneurs possess is really looking at both sides. It's what makes now the correct time to solve this problem, as well as why is this an important problem to solve.
Okay, so this is all well and good, all this big ideas. I got a big push or I got a big pull. What, though, actually happens, let me skip ahead here, when an investor, such as this one, Mark Andreessen's a very famous investor here at Andreessen Horowitz, and he was the founder of Netscape, the first browser, investor in Facebook, all this. Very, very famous person. We're going to send around after the webinar a link to a 3-minute talk by Mark. We at Stanford shoot a lot of videos and put them on the web. This is a 3-minute talk that I think encapsulates this notion of what's the difference between an idea and a true opportunity better than anything. And what Mark goes into is the next slide. He says, look, the perfect situation as an investor is you come across some entrepreneurs that have they're pursuing a big market, and there was a big problem that's growing like crazy. They have a product or technology that's 10 times better than anybody else. And they have an excellent team put together, or at least the beginning of an excellent team put together that's balanced with some wonderful technologists along with some wonderful business people or marketing type people. So that's perfection. Tell us the story about that.
Sure. Zynga is an example. I worked at Zynga a number of years ago. This is the company that made Wars with Friends and Farmville and some of the other early games. In the 2008 to 2011.
Yeah, it was a big deal in those days.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really important at that time was the timing mattered a lot in terms of the big market and Mark Andreessen's frameworks. One of the things that had just changed in the world was Facebook was starting to become big. And at that point, there were starting to become tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people on Facebook on a daily basis. And it's a totally different mode from console gaming, like Xbox or Nintendo or anything else.
Which was a tenth of that.
Exactly. So at this time, the founders kind of looked at that and they said, here's an opportunity to combine two things. Here's an opportunity to combine millions of people in one place, which has been the holy grail of gaming for a long time, but also the opportunity to finally play with your friends. And the early online push in the late 90s, early 2000s was really the first time you started playing with other people who were in a different room instead of your friends.
So that was enabled. So how did Zynga exploit it with their technology?
It was very enabled by Facebook, right? And it was enabled by the internet in general. So kind of the second thesis of the company was that in the past, games were considered very much like movies, more of an art than a science. I think one of the theses that Zynga brought to the table was we can apply some of the scientific methodologies that we'll talk about in a few slides to games, and it turned out to be a recipe for, at least at the time, something that was...
So from the 80s, I think Electronic Arts was an example of that.
Exactly.
So Zynga comes along. I think there were some executive Electronic Arts people. They came along and saw it slightly different, and that was their technology advantage.
Very much so.
And then the team itself?
So the team, there were some really contrarian beliefs on the team in terms of hiring. Most people in the industry tended to hire other people from the industry. Zynga actually hired a lot of people with analytical or very strong technical backgrounds, and that was kind of a thesis of we can do something a slightly different way and see if it works. So much more analysis heavy, much more metrics heavy than anything that had ever been done at the time. And it was a very successful initial recipe.
Well, folks, what you just heard was a story. If we turned back, got in the Wayback Machine and went back to 5-10 years ago, that is the story that would have been told by the Zynga executives and founders as they were pitching or telling the narrative about their opportunity. What you just heard, and encapsulated all of that. Let's move ahead to the next slide. And that is the second item here, and this is about the following. As a startup, what is the major risk to reduce ASAP, as soon as possible? The most important hypothesis to test. This has been a fascinating discussion. I have a little bit of perspective because of having been involved in the Valley for 10 years after getting out of Berkeley, and then coming here to be an academic for the last 20 years. And the traditional way of talking about building a startup, it's great to write a plan, but the actual get underway was to talk about it this way. It was to say, look, there's risk involved, and it's not a risk that you can run investment science models against. It's something that it's going to take a good bit of qualitative analysis in addition to quantitative, but there's been a search for some heuristics. And so along those lines, the traditional way was to say, look, there's many different categories of risk. Team risk, and this is sort of mirrors what we were just talking about. product or technology risk, market risk, and then add in financial risk. What is the business model? I mean, how much money is going to be necessary to raise to get to an operation that's profitable? Use that as the way of communicating. So not only did we looked at it from an investor perspective just a few moments ago, and Anand told the story. This time I'm saying look at it think of you as the entrepreneur,
right,
and how are you choosing to spend your money? You only have a certain amount of money to spend in the coming year. What risk are you going to address right away?
Mm-hmm. So I can give another example, this time from Dropbox.
Mm-hmm.
So Dropbox, for those of you not familiar with it, is kind of an online file sync and storage platform. And
competes with Drive and Box.
And a lot of other things. And one of the big challenges that the company spent a lot of time thinking about in the past few years is the market risk. So the company has raised over $500 million. It's a good place from the capital risk perspective. And the team risk perspective has a very high bar for engineers, product managers, and a lot of other talented people in the company. From the technology and the product risk perspective, the company has 400 million users, so it's clear that it's on to something. But from the market risk perspective, Google is getting into the game, Apple is getting into the game, Microsoft is getting into the game. So it's getting more and more competitive. So it's very much focused all of its time on the market risk. And I think what you'll see is it involves changing some fundamental things about the business and how we think about the product as the only way to actually mitigate market risk. So we're very focused on that. But the wheel has changed, right? At the beginning of the company, when it was only 100 some odd people, it was very much focused on building the team, and it was very much focused on capital. So I think the way this model, at least in my head, works is you can't get any one too far ahead of the others. You need to keep them all somewhat in sync. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you'll end up with a very lopsided business.
Thanks. Well, excellent illustration. I think it's probably worthwhile to step back for a second because, again, we chose this title, The Spirit of Entrepreneurship, realizing that we were going to have a broad audience with a very variety of backgrounds. I'm going to do a bit of historical perspective. So what happened from that risk wheels have been popular for decades in the Silicon Valley style of entrepreneurship. So wonderful. But it's gotten refined here lately. And that's good because it's a set of terminologies come along to recognize that the business plan and the writing of a business plan and the pitching of a business plan is really not the point. Mm-hmm. I mean, for so long that was seen, I mean, it was a bit of a myth. It was a little bit like, well, entrepreneurship's about getting rich. That's one myth that I hope we just busted. And the other one was, well, if I just write a really solid business plan, either write it or put some PowerPoints together, that's the key to getting funded and underway. Well, starting with one of our friends and colleagues that helps us teach here, Randy Komisar and a fellow at the London Business School, they wrote this book around the time you were a student, I believe, Getting to Plan B, and we've used it in classes we've taught at the master's level. And it just makes a simple point. Plan A's rarely work. And so how do you get to Plan B and C? I mean, how do you build these dashboards and measure stuff and change? Simultaneously along comes another method called the lean startup method. And it's become so popular, for good reason, that Harvard Business Review put it on their cover 2 or 3 years ago. We're pleased to have Steve Blank teach with us here at Stanford as well, and he's the author of this. In fact, he's part of a threesome, if you will, of really good thought leaders. There, his book is there on the upper left, and along with Eric Ries in the bottom left and a fellow named Osterwalder in Europe on the right-hand side. They've developed these tools to do marketing in startup, to do product development in startup, and then to visualize the entire operation, and that's that canvas you see on the right-hand side. And there's a lot on the web about this, so I just bring everybody's attention to it. In the spirit of entrepreneurship, what are we to make of all this? This is what we want to chat about now and take away. A couple of quotes by Eric Ries in the Lean Startup catch my eye, especially the last one. Lean startups are driven by a compelling vision, which we just talked about in our first segment, and are rigorous about testing each element of the vision. What's he talking about?
Right. So, I mean, we need to jump back hundreds of years to where this story started, right? In my view, this is just the application of the scientific method to business or to entrepreneurship. And kind of the core things you need to answer are, what is my thesis about the world, or what is my hypothesis, and how do I know that it's right? And in 50 years ago or 60 years ago, companies like IBM and GE were trying to answer those questions, but it took months at a time or even years at a time to run the full loop to get enough information back to get a good answer. What's happened in the past call it 10-ish years is the cost of answering the questions has become very low, and the speed at which you can answer the questions has become very high. This fundamentally changes something about the game.
For example,
right?
Dropbox runs its, what it used to run its product on Amazon's servers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very easy for Dropbox to get into business.
And not only that,
compared to the past,
we would have hundreds of experiments live at any point in time. We pushed new versions of the product, sometimes multiple times per day. So our ability to be iterative dramatically increases your ability to be hypothesis-driven. So I think the point of this is, for all the good that frameworks do, they are just frameworks. The really key takeaway here is it's really important as an entrepreneur to know what you believe, but also why you believe it. And this just gets on the second point of knowing why you believe it should be some information that you get back from the world. So you can call it an iterative hypothesis-driven loop, you can call it a testing loop, but fundamentally what you're trying to do is say, I think something is true, and instead of making a 5-year, 10-year bet on that, you go find out if something is true.
Yeah.
You think about the cheapest and the fastest way to do that. So to Eric's point about the methodology not being about cost and being about speed, I would add another nuance. It's about speed in the correct direction. So making sure you're not sprinting after something that turns out to be just totally wrong in the world, and it's making sure that you are validating your beliefs with what is actually true.
That's terrific. I'm flashing, Anand, on when you came to visit me and helped me teach at Stanford's campus in Florence, Italy, several years ago, and we were teaching, and right across the river there was the Galileo Museum. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was the week or when you were there, but I took the students to the Galileo Museum, and we saw Galileo's 21 telescopes because the 21st worked. Mm-hmm. The 20th were all prototypes. Now, imagine what he could have done with the internet. Or 3D printing. Right. Imagine what he could have done, and notwithstanding maybe still, even under house arrest, imagine what he could have done with a 3D printer. So this is an extraordinary time, but the methods behind this, and more importantly, the spirit of wanting to test. Failure is not a bad thing. It's just gathering data. And that goes back 500 years.
Very much. And how quickly can you be right? And I think that's the purpose of the methodology.
Yeah, and have the psychology not to give up. Mm-hmm. I mean,
and be willing to change your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is non-trivial.
All right, so terrific. So let's go on to the third and last one. And that would be about people. Yep. I mean, we've been sitting here talking about storytelling, about measuring and testing. So let's talk about people. So there's this picture here. I hope everybody on the webinar has seen it before. Oh, I bet the majority of them have. Who is that? What company is that? Well, that is a company that was started about 40 years ago and then became the largest technology company in the world, and it's Microsoft. There's Bill Gates on the bottom left. And it looks like a whole bunch of they look like my classmates at Berkeley back in those days, frankly. So they were a team. The point is this entrepreneurship, and we've used this a lot in our teaching, it's an extreme team sport. It is not singles tennis. Mm-hmm. It is not golf or whatever. It's the strategy involved like chess, but it is a team effort. So what's the point of that? How do you turn that into innovation? And so there's a simple little model I want to use here to talk about this, and it comes from a professor at Berkeley I admire, that it's all about innovating. Anybody wants to innovate. Colleges, governments, businesses, large and small. To get to a culture of innovation, it's a function of two things. Creativity and teamwork, you see them there on the screen. And it's a logical and, meaning, if you have lots of creativity and no teamwork, okay, no innovation. If you have lots of teamwork and no creativity, no innovation. They've got to both be there. What do you think about this model?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about culture, and I think it's important to step back and ask, what is the purpose? Like, what problem are we trying to solve with culture in the first place? And in general, I think culture is a tool for getting some outcome that you care about. Facebook, for example, is very famous for having a cultural value of moving fast and break things. that is very much not a value that you would want the FDA to have when they're testing drugs. So in terms of like, is there a correct culture? Is there a good culture? I don't think there's a good answer to that question. It depends on what matters to you, what matters to your business, and kind of the values you have as a person. So my thoughts on creativity and innovation in the team are that it's worth starting from the opposite mode and saying, what do we think matters for this to work, or for us, our company to be successful, or for the values that we have, and try and design your culture around that. Another note on this point is that culture will always happen. It will either be an emergent property where you don't do it intentionally, or you can be intentional about it and choose to shape the values in ways you think are important. So one of the things that I've seen good entrepreneurs do is recognize that this will happen, and the best way to do that is to have it happen intentionally instead of having it happen on accident.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, I also think, let's assume we accept this model, and this is a method on how to get to an innovative culture. So some of us are more comfortable with, if you're the leader, some of us are more comfortable in one of them. Like, for example, I'm a cup is half full kind of person. I like to get along with everybody. So I'm assuming most of the times the things that I'm in charge of are going to be good teams, because it's natural for me.
Right.
I'm not the most creative person in the world, so I'm a little uneasy about that. And what I've had to work on over and over in both business and academic careers, and as I got more and more leadership positions, is okay to really be entrepreneurial, to make advancements, leveraging innovation. I've got to embrace creative people, and that means that they're slightly, they're slightly crazy, and it's slightly unusual, and they may not. There may be some friction to the consensus sort of get along teamwork that makes me most comfortable. Where are you on that? Is it hard for you?
More on the other side, right?
If I recall, you're quite creative. And
yeah, much more on the other side, but I think you're hitting on an important point, which is another characteristic of good entrepreneurial teams. They tend to surround themselves with people who are not like them. So instead of quadrupling down on things that are your strengths, it's much better in general to shore up things that are your weaknesses. So, for example, pairing with someone like Tina, who is incredibly creative, is very successful.
We're talking about Tina Seelig of STVP.
Exactly. Yeah. So another thing I think a lot on the teams that I manage is how we can get sets of people together that have the complete set of skills we need. And you're right, it's not always easy. Sometimes there are conflicts of ideas, there are conflicts of culture, but in general, if you can separate the respect for the person from respect for the ideas, and always respect the person, but be willing to change your mind about the ideas. Yeah. I've seen good stuff happen.
All right. Well, I'm keeping an eye on the time so we can answer some questions. Let me go on to the next one. And I think that is, we're wrapping up here. Here were 3 themes that we chose from, oh my goodness, a whole bunch. I mean, the textbook's 400 pages long, so we had fun choosing just 3 to talk about, but they were mirroring that model that we showed at the very beginning about the end of the day, a true opportunity. In other words, a true entrepreneurial opportunity is one that has a large market, a kick-ass product, a 10x better product or technology, and a team that is innovative. So that was the way we wanted to step through this. That's the spirit behind all these models, and I think I'll urge people, by the way, if they like what they heard, to take a look at some of these materials. We have, as I promised, we'd send around one of the videos. We have several thousand videos that we've shot in our partnership with SCPD that are available at no charge. Their little sound bites are also up on YouTube, and some of the themes of today are highlighted in these books by our colleagues here at Stanford and elsewhere. Yeah. So let's answer some questions. Thank you, Anand.
Yeah, thank you for being here, everyone.
Tom and Anand, one of the first questions that we got that I'd like to pose to you is we've been talking a lot about startups. How is this relevant to intrapreneurs, not just entrepreneurs? Is there any relevance in the more corporate established world, and how would you, what would you have to say about that?
I'm glad we got that question, because I was thinking, oh man, we should have talked about that a little bit. So you want to take it first?
Sure.
Or no?
Sure.
Add on?
Like we talked about at the very beginning, our thesis that I think we've seen true hold over 10 years of teaching is that a lot of the things we talk about as entrepreneurial characteristics are very much teachable skills. Mm-hmm. And many of those skills are skills that also apply in, call it, larger or more corporate settings. So as an example, there are a number of corporations that have small arms inside them that do new product development or kind of new markets or emerging market type work. So I think there's not a perfect overlap between the two, but that many of the skills are highly applicable from one to the other. So for people who are interested, maybe not in starting your own company, but in getting a leg up on being more creative or more entrepreneurial in a larger corporate environment, I still think a lot of these skills are very relevant.
Absolutely. When we talk to employers about the curriculum that we've built here at Stanford, it's available to any engineering, science, math major, frankly, even the humanities majors. The employers are thrilled to see that we're talking about entrepreneurship, because we make sure we're talking about entrepreneurial management, entrepreneurial leadership, innovation, creativity, leadership. And the corporations say, thanks, you're doing us a great service. Some of the skills we're talking about here that endure, because we were just talking about this earlier this morning, though. Let me back up a sec. You know, any of the examples we used this morning, or even the methods, I mean, in 2026, I mean, I met you 10 years ago, and we were learning some things together, like Jeff Moore's material endures. And he's going to be this webinar in 2 months. I highly recommend everybody do that, because his stuff endures. But the other stuff has fallen by the wayside. Methods and processes are going to come and go, but the technologies will change dramatically, but the spirit is what doesn't change. I mean, I believe these skills that are necessary to be, in the workforce of the 21st century have to do with strategic thinking, have to do with interpersonal skills, and if nothing else, it's a great way to learn just enough about business to be dangerous. I mean, in other words, to be informed, because business is so important on how the world works. You as an engineer, if you come in and say, well, I'm going to teach you about business, you say, well, wait a minute, I'm not majoring in business. But we use this as a way just to get you prepared for the workforce. What else you got, Ron?
So one more question that we got that I think is really relevant, for the question of startups is, how do you overcome the fear of failure?
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
You talk about that first.
Yeah, so I have worked at some startups that have been successful and some startups that have gone out of business. And for me, one of the things that I had to get comfortable with was recognizing that in most cases, the probable path is going out of business. And I'll be very transparent. That's the thing you have to get comfortable with, right? Everyone believes their opinion, their idea is special. Everyone believes their thing is different. But if you look at this from the probability level, you will most likely go out of business. So I think that you have to some extent, you need to be able to block that out a little bit, knowing that is the most probable path. Because if you just sit down and you look at the probabilities, you're like, there's no way I should do this at all. But I think to answer the question more directly, it is impossible to do it with a strong fear of failure. But at the same time, you need to know that risk is there and it is meaningful and it is also most likely the default path. And you need to separate your identity from, call it, the business itself. The places where I've seen people run into a lot of trouble are where their identity, their personal identity, gets extremely wrapped up in, this is my idea, this is my business. And I'll be honest, I have friends where it's led to depression or other things, and it can be dangerous. But if you can pull apart kind of your concept of yourself from, I have this idea, and actually treat them as very separate things, then I think it's just being comfortable with risk.
Roni, Anand, thinking about this, we probably should have called the whole webinar "Getting Over the Fear of Failure." I mean, maybe that's the tagline to the title, "The Spirit of Entrepreneurship." We all have our stories to tell. I was lucky to be at the formation at Symantec. Symantec's still around. It's a big antivirus software company and now in cybersecurity. But right after that, I started a company with a fellow that had invented the spreadsheet. I mean, thinking of, and I just thought we were invincible. I mean, my goodness, I'm starting a company with somebody who wrote the very, very first spreadsheet. It was called VisiCalc. And we were going to get in the business of these pens and fingers on computers, and this is a long, long time ago. Well, we failed miserably. And I knew that to fail was part of the culture here. It was okay. We didn't do anything unethical.
Yeah.
If you fail and do something unethical, then game over.
Yeah.
I mean, character still matters. But we hadn't done that. But man, was I down. I was down. I had very little confidence in myself. So that fear is real, like you talked about. The other thing I want to mention about this is we touched on it briefly about that scientific method. I mean, scientists fail all the time. They're doing technology-oriented things. Why is it that when we think about the scientific method for business, we get a little freaked out, like, oh, it's failure. It's not data gathering. Well, scientists do data gathering because 99 out of 100 of their experiments are going to fail until they hit it, like the Galileo story. Why is it that as we apply the scientific method, now that we have all these tools to do that, to business and economic situations, why is it that we see that as failure rather than data gathering?
Maybe one last part of this question. Something that's been a useful tool for me personally is trying to prove myself wrong. Because if you think about kind of the logical extreme of this, launching a company, having an idea, starting a new product inside a large company, in all of the scenarios you're trying to say, will this thing work? Many other people will be trying to prove you wrong. I've found it is best if you are at the front of that pack, because you tend to find out that you're wrong the fastest, and then you can change your mind to be right. So there's something about almost having like a negative framing towards things, which is I have an idea. You need to have confidence that it will work, but you should be the first person who sees the information that it won't work and be willing to change your mind.
All right, so one more question, and trying to bring in the world of venture capital into the fold, because it is a very important component of this activity. So we've gotten a number of questions about that. One of them is, how do you prepare to get in front of a venture capitalist? And then the other is, can they be trusted with your idea? What's your take on that in terms of NDAs and
Sure.
stuff?
Well, you do some investing.
I do.
So,
and I worked in venture capital for a while. So for anyone who's very interested in this topic, I would highly, highly recommend some materials from a group called Y Combinator. They're free. They're online. Go look for them. I believe it's called, they just started a blog in the past 6 months. It's like how to raise money, something along those lines. It has pages and pages of information, all of which I found to be accurate and true. But to answer those questions like very, very directly, can they be trusted? Like, what's the best way to prepare for this? It is a very niche and specialized skill. Like, it doesn't exist in most of the world in general. And the best way to prepare tends to be practice. So for us, when we were raising money, a couple companies ago when we worked together, we just did a lot of practice. We would practice with our friends. We would practice with other people. We would get smart people or investors whose opinions we trusted and say, tell us why this thing is wrong. And eventually, after doing that 30 or 50 times, you get something that is hardened and you can kind of stand up to the ideas. I think it's one of the things that I've seen as an investor is a strong preference for investing in something that is working versus something that might work. So I think part of it is being honest with yourself about what stage are you actually ready to get someone else involved to give you money. And it tends to work a little bit better for everyone. If it's clear that something is working, you can consider this to some extent scaling capital versus I think this might work capital. To the very specific question around NDAs and trust, I think it's generally, the perception at least is it's viewed as kind of a sign of being a novice of the game when you ask someone to sign an NDA or anything like that. And I actually don't think it's that damaging. I would have some expectation that maybe they will tell someone else about your idea, but I also have an expectation that it probably won't matter. Ideas are worth a very, very tiny percentage of the potential, and execution and many other things are worth much more. So in my own personal life, as I'm thinking about businesses or talking to friends who are doing it, I tend to not keep ideas secret, and it has never once come back to bite me. It turns out that it's much harder to do the thing than it is to talk about the thing.
Yeah, I would just use the same filter as you develop your close personal relationships, whether they be friendly, romantic, otherwise. I mean, you pick a roommate.
Yeah.
Well, how can you trust your roommate? I mean, and you go through some sort of process to get there. And right now, the flavor of the philosophy of Silicon Valley is to share, because things move so fast that it's much more important to vet your ideas than to hold them back as secrets and then think ignore the advice of others and try to do this on your own. So it's worth taking the risk on that. I also encourage everybody to study the industry of venture capital. Y Combinator's got great materials. There's a lot of materials. Noam Wasserman's book, Founders Dilemmas, is an incredible book. He used to be at Harvard, and now he's at University of Southern California. That book, Founders Dilemmas, does a fantastic job of looking at various dilemmas, including one of them is a chapter we used to use it in our that finance course. We still use it, about the pros and cons of every different source of capital. Because remember, venture capital is just one source of capital. There's crowdfunding, there's raising money from angels, there's raising money from corporations.
Private equity.
Yeah, all that. And so he goes through a nice, detailed, well-researched explanation of the advantages and disadvantages of each source of capital, including traditional venture capital.
All right, and I would say one last question, because we're almost at the top of the hour. Is there any advice that you would give social entrepreneurs? Is it different than other kinds of entrepreneurs?
Let's talk about social entrepreneurship. You want to go first? Or?
Sure. I think the skills are very similar and analogous. A lot of it depends on kind of how you see the end game of the company. For me, something that's been really successful is pairing some of the things that I think drive for-profit companies with, call it, missions that are more focused on social good. I think that intersection has resulted in some really interesting and really powerful ideas. I don't think it's a fundamentally different game. I think you're much more likely to get people who want to help because they think the mission is good. And I think you can use that as, to some extent, a comparative advantage of you can go get really smart people who have amazing other opportunities but care deeply about a thing to focus on your problem. And I think to some extent that can be helpful.
Yeah, everything we talked about today I think is applicable to a classic social venture, I guess is the right way to put it. We feel strongly about this here in the courses that we offer out of the engineering school, and if I add them all up, the entrepreneurship courses, the design thinking courses, and we're talking about a couple dozen courses per term. We're on the quarter system here, so per term, and then you add in what the business school offers. I'd say 90% of them are going to be applicable to both situations, for-profit companies and others. I want to clarify this, and we said this at the beginning, a long time ago, an hour ago. We said we are talking about Silicon Valley type entrepreneurship here, which has a technology component to it generally, or at least heavily influenced by technology. Well, maybe another way to put it is, it is not about small business. In other words, a small business is a different type of discussion. A small charity is a different kind of discussion. But for the nonprofits that want to scale, like something like Conservation International, which I'm involved in, or Gates Foundation, the ones that want to go to scale, that is absolutely the same thing as what we were talking about here.
All right. So again, I want to thank you so much, Tom and Anand, for spending this hour with us. I think from looking at the chat and the Q&A, there are lots of other questions. So definitely
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
A lot of excitement and curiosity about this, and I think it was very inspiring to hear you. Again, I inspire our audience on the line to sign up for our next webinars. There's one in February, one in March. Both of them promise to be really interesting opportunities to learn more from Stanford experts and industry experts. And then go check out our website at create.stanford.edu. All of you will be getting a link to the recording of this webinar, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.